They said she belonged to a warrior, yet every night she left her door unlatched for a man who never came back. The desert held its breath around her, stretching for miles in every direction, dry wind whispering through mesquite and dust as the last light of the sun bled across the horizon like a slow farewell. Nayeli stood at the edge of the Apache camp, where the firelight faded into shadow, her fingers tracing the frayed edge of a small piece of cloth she kept hidden in her palm. It was nothing to anyone else, just torn fabric, sun-bleached and worn thin by time. But to her, it carried a weight no one in the tribe could see. The elders believed she was preparing herself for the ceremony. They watched her with quiet approval, whispering of honor, of tradition, of the strength it took to accept the path laid before her. Takota, the warrior chosen for her, stood tall among them, his presence steady, his reputation carved from years of discipline and respect. He had done nothing wrong. That was the hardest part. He was everything a man should be in their world. Strong, loyal, unshaken by doubt. And still, when his eyes found hers across the firelight, she felt nothing but distance, like looking across a canyon too wide to cross. The drums would begin soon. The promise would be spoken aloud. And once spoken, it would bind her in ways no wind could ever undo. A few women moved around her, adjusting beads, brushing dust from her shoulders, speaking softly in a language that carried generations of expectation. Nayeli nodded when she had to, let them guide her hands, her posture, her silence. But her gaze kept drifting, past the camp, past the ridge, toward the empty stretch of land where the sky met the earth in a thin, trembling line. That was where she had last seen him, not as a memory carved in words, but as something quieter, a moment caught between heartbeat and breath. A man who had stepped into a storm without asking who she was, or what it would cost him. A man who had spoken little, left even less behind, except for the cloth now pressed against her skin. She closed her fingers around it, feeling its roughness, grounding herself against the weight of everything closing in. Somewhere behind her, a voice called her name.
Come. Certain.
Takota. She didn't turn right away. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of leather, firewood, and distant rain that would never reach them. For a second, just one, she allowed herself to imagine the sound of hooves in the distance, slow and steady, cutting through the silence like a promise kept too late. But the land remained still. It always did. She opened her eyes fully, the dream dissolving without protest, and stepped forward into the circle of light where everyone expected her to belong. Yet even as she moved, something in her stayed behind, standing in that quiet space between hope and memory, waiting for a man who might never return, and knowing, deep beneath the silence, that if he did, nothing in this desert would remain the same. The fire burned low but steady, its glow stretching across the circle like a line no one dared to cross, and beyond it the night gathered thick and quiet, wrapping the camp in a silence that felt heavier than any storm. Nayeli stood where the light touched her shoulders and stopped at her feet, the rest of her fading into shadow as if she belonged to two worlds at once, and neither would claim her fully. Around her, the elders began their slow movements, deliberate and practiced, hands lifting carved tokens, voices murmuring words that had been spoken the same way for longer than memory could hold. Each sound carried weight. Each pause meant something. And every eye in the circle rested on her, without turning away. Takota stepped forward when his name was spoken, the beads on his chest catching the firelight in small flashes that moved when he breathed. He did not look at the others. He looked only at her. There was no anger in his gaze, no impatience, only a quiet certainty, like a man who had already accepted the path ahead and saw no reason to question it. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing, steady as the land beneath them. "You will stand beside me," he said, his voice low, not a command, not a question, simply a truth he believed had already been decided. Nayeli did not answer. Right away, the wind shifted again, brushing past her cheek, lifting a strand of her dark hair before letting it fall back into place. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once and then fell silent, as if even the wild knew this moment was not to be disturbed. She felt the eyes of the women behind her, the weight of expectation pressing forward like a hand at her back, guiding her toward a future she had never chosen but had always known was waiting. Slowly, she opened her hand again, just enough to feel the edge of the cloth against her skin, the faint roughness reminding her of something that did not belong to this circle, this fire, this promise. Dakota followed the movement, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before returning to her face. "You hold on to something that is not from here," he said quietly. "You should let it go." His words were calm, but there was something beneath them. Not suspicion, not yet, but the beginning of a question he had not fully formed. Nayeli lifted her chin slightly, meeting his eyes without stepping closer. "Not everything needs to be let go," she said, her voice soft but steady, the kind of tone that did not invite argument, but did not yield either. A murmur passed through the circle, subtle, almost swallowed by the crackle of the fire, but enough to shift the air between them. The elder nearest the flames raised a hand, and the voices faded again, leaving only the sound of wood settling into ash. "The night does not wait," the elder said, his voice worn but strong. "And neither do promises." Dakota extended his hand toward her then, palm open, patient, as if he could stand there all night, if that was what it took. Nayeli looked at it, at the lines shaped by years of work and discipline, at the life it offered, solid and unchanging. For a moment, everything slowed. The fire dimmed. The wind stilled. Even her own breath seemed to pause somewhere between her chest and the world. Then, faint and far beyond the ridge, something moved. Not loud, not certain, just a distant echo carried on the edge of the wind, like the memory of hoofbeats that may or may not have been real. Her fingers tightened around the cloth, and for the smallest moment, her eyes flickered toward the dark horizon before returning to the man in front of her, and though her body remained still within the circle of light, something inside her stepped back, refusing to move forward until the silence itself revealed what it had been holding all along. The sound did not come again, and that was what unsettled her most, not the absence, but the way it lingered in her mind like something unfinished, something that had almost happened and then chose not to. Nayeli stood unmoving, her eyes still fixed on Dakota's outstretched hand, but the world around her had already begun to shift, not in sight or sound, but in memory, pulling her backward to a moment that had never truly left her. It had been late afternoon when the sky turned without warning, the kind of change that rolled across the desert in seconds, swallowing light and replacing it with wind that cut through cloth and skin alike. She had been alone then, far beyond the safety of the camp, gathering herbs near the dry riverbed where the ground cracked like old paint beneath her feet. The air had gone still first, too still, and then the wind came, sudden and sharp, lifting sand into the air until the horizon disappeared entirely. She remembered the way the world had narrowed to a few feet in front of her, how every direction looked the same, how the ground itself seemed to shift beneath her steps as if it no longer wanted to be known. She had tried to move, tried to find her way back, but the storm had taken that from her, turning distance into confusion and silence into something louder than any voice. That was when she saw him. Not clearly at first, just a shape through the moving dust, a figure that did not belong to the storm but moved through it with purpose. He had not called out. He had not asked who she was or why she was there. He had simply reached her, steady and certain, as if the wind had no claim on him at all. His coat had been pulled tight against the storm, his hat low, shadowing his face, so she could not see his eyes, only the line of his jaw and the calm in the way he stood. When the ground beneath her shifted again, when her footing gave just enough to send her off balance, his hand had found her arm without hesitation, firm but careful, holding her steady until she found it again herself.
No ruse, no panique.
Just presence. He had guided her then, not by pulling, not by forcing, but by walking ahead and letting her follow, one step at a time, until the storm began to thin and the shape of the land returned beneath their feet. She had wanted to speak when the wind finally softened, to ask his name, to understand why he had stopped when others might have ridden past. But the words had never come. He had adjusted the edge of her torn sleeve where the fabric had caught on brush, his fingers quick and respectful, and for a brief second their eyes had met, his clear and unreadable, hers still filled with the storm. Then he had stepped back.
No pramis. No explanation.
Only a small piece of cloth left behind when the wind caught his coat again, tearing it loose without either of them noticing until it was already gone. By the time she looked up fully, he was already walking away, his figure fading into the distance the same way he had appeared, as if the land had borrowed him for a moment and then taken him back. Naeli blinked, and the firelight returned, sharp and real, the circle around her unchanged, the hand still waiting in front of her. But the memory remained, steady and undeniable, pressing against the present like a truth that refused to be buried, and somewhere deep within her, she understood that what had happened in that storm had not been chance, and that the silence following it had been louder than any promise she was being asked to accept now. The fire cracked softly as a piece of wood shifted and broke inward, sending a brief spiral of sparks into the night before they vanished into the dark, and still Takoda's hand remained where it was, steady, patient, waiting for a choice that everyone believed had already been made. Naeli felt the weight of every eye again, heavier now, sharper, as if the silence itself had begun to press against her ribs, asking for an answer she was not ready to give. The elder's voice lingered in the air, not repeated, not forced, just present, like a line drawn in the sand that no one crossed without consequence. She could feel the women behind her shift slightly, their movements small but meaningful, a quiet urging forward, a reminder of where she stood and what it meant to belong. Belonging. The word settled in her chest with a strange weight, not comforting, not painful, just undeniable. This was her people. This was her land. Every step she had ever taken had been on this ground. Every story she had ever heard had been spoken in these voices, and every expectation now rested in the space between her and the man in front of her. Takoda did not move closer, did not withdraw. He simply waited, his eyes holding hers with a calm that might have been kindness or might have been certainty. It was hard to tell the difference. "You do not have to fear this," he said quietly, his tone even measured, as if he believed fear was the only thing that could keep her from stepping forward. "There is strength in walking the path that is given." Naeli let the words settle without answering. Strength. Another word that had followed her all her life, shaped by others, defined by actions she had never questioned until now. Strength meant obedience. Strength meant silence. Strength meant choosing the tribe over the self. That was what she had been taught. That was what everyone here believed. And yet, somewhere beneath all of it, something else had taken root, something quieter but no less firm, something that did not come from tradition or expectation, but from a moment in a storm where no one had asked anything of her and nothing had been demanded in return. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth, the small piece of another world pressing into her palm, as if it carried its own answer. She looked at Takoda again, really looked this time, at the steadiness in his stance, the absence of doubt, the life he represented. There was no cruelty in him.
No arrogance.
Only certainty. He would protect her. He would honor her. He would give her a place that no one would question. It was everything she was supposed to want. And still, something in her remained still, unmoved, like a stone that refused to shift no matter how strong the current. "What if the path is wrong?" she said softly, the words barely louder than the wind but clear enough that they carried through the circle and settled into every ear that listened. The murmur that followed was not loud, but it was immediate, a ripple through the gathered voices that had not expected resistance to take shape so plainly. Takoda's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, just enough to show that he had heard more than the words themselves. "The path is not chosen by one," he replied, his voice still calm, but firmer now, like ground that had hardened beneath his feet. "It is chosen for the good of all." Naeli held his gaze, and for a moment, the world narrowed again, not to a storm this time, but to a single point where two truths met and neither gave way. Behind her, the fire shifted again, casting longer shadows that stretched across the ground like lines reaching toward her feet. In front of her, his hand remained, unchanged, waiting. And somewhere beyond the ridge, far enough to be denied and close enough to be felt, the silence returned. Not empty this time, but holding something just out of reach, something that made her breath slow and her heart steady in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with knowing that the choice in front of her was not between two men, but between two lives that could not exist in the same place at the same time. The murmur did not fade this time. It spread, slow and low, like wind moving through dry grass, carrying with it something sharper than surprise, something closer to concern, and the circle that had once felt solid now shifted in ways no one could see, but everyone could feel. Nayeli stood where she was, but the space around her no longer held the same certainty, as if the ground itself had begun to question the step she had not yet taken. Takoda lowered his hand, not abruptly, not in anger, but with a deliberate calm that made the movement feel heavier than if he had forced it. He let it fall to his side, fingers relaxed, shoulders steady, but his eyes did not leave hers. "You speak as if the path is yours alone," he said, and though his voice remained controlled, there was a new edge beneath it, not sharp, but present, like a blade still in its sheath. "But no one walks alone out here." Nayeli did not step back. She did not step forward. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the quiet tension in her eyes, the stillness in her breath. "I have walked alone before," she replied, just as softly, but the words landed differently, carrying something that did not belong to the circle, something that came from beyond it. A few heads turned at that, subtle, restrained, but enough to show that the balance had shifted again. The elder nearest the fire watched them both, his gaze moving between the two, like someone measuring distance that could not be seen with the eye.
He did not speak.
Not yet. The silence stretched, long enough that even the smallest sound became clear, the settling of ash, the faint creak of leather, the whisper of wind brushing against the edges of the camp. Then it came again. Not imagined this time. Not memory. A sound carried from beyond the ridge, distant but unmistakable, the rhythm slow and steady, hooves against dry earth, far enough to be uncertain, close enough to be real. One rider. Not many. Just one. The effect was immediate, though no one moved in haste. A few of the younger men shifted their stance, turning their heads toward the sound, listening without speaking. The women behind Nayeli grew still, their earlier movements gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that settled over the entire camp like a shadow passing across the sun. Takoda's gaze did not follow the others at first. He remained focused on her, searching her face, and in that moment, he saw it, not doubt, not fear, but recognition. That was when he turned.
Slowly.
Deliberately. His eyes moved past the fire, past the outer edges of the camp, toward the dark line of the horizon where the sound had come from. The hoofbeats continued, unhurried, not a charge, not a threat, just a presence approaching without apology. Nayeli felt something shift inside her chest, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady, like a door that had been closed for too long finally giving way. She did not move toward the sound. She did not call out. She simply stood where she was, her hand still closed around the cloth, her gaze no longer fixed on the man in front of her, but drawn outward, toward the place where the land met the sky, and something she had never asked for was now returning without being called. The elder finally raised his hand again, not to begin the ceremony, but to pause it, the gesture small but absolute, and the voices that had once filled the circle fell away completely, leaving only the fire, the wind, and the slow, steady approach of a single rider crossing a distance that now felt shorter than it ever had before. The hoofbeats grew clearer with each passing second, no longer something carried by imagination or distance, but real, measured, deliberate, like a man who had no need to rush and no reason to hide, and as the sound drew closer, the entire camp seemed to shift its weight without moving, every breath held just beneath the surface. The rider appeared at the edge of the ridge, first as a silhouette against the dim stretch of sky, then slowly taking form as he guided his horse down the slope with an ease that spoke of long miles and quiet confidence. The animal moved steady, unbothered by the unfamiliar scent of fire and gathered people, its hooves pressing into the dry earth with a rhythm that did not falter. Nayeli did not look away. She knew before the light reached his face. The shape of him, the way he sat in the saddle, the stillness in his shoulders, it was the same presence that had stepped through the storm without asking for anything in return. Ethan Cole. He brought the horse to a stop just beyond the edge of the firelight, far enough to show respect, close enough to be heard without raising his voice. He did not reach for anything. His hands rested loose, visible, the reins held lightly as if he trusted the moment to hold itself together without force. His hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but when he lifted his head slightly, the firelight caught enough to show that he was looking at her. Not the circle, not the men, only her. "I came to return something," he said, his voice calm, carrying. Across the space without effort, each word placed carefully, as if he understood exactly where he stood and what it meant. The elder watched him without speaking, his expression unreadable, but his silence allowed the moment to continue, and that was all the permission needed. Ethan shifted in the saddle and reached slowly into his coat, not hurried, not cautious, just deliberate, and when his hand came back out, it held a small piece of fabric, worn at the edges, the color faded by sun and time. The twin of the one Nayeli held. He glanced at it briefly, then back at her. "It tore loose that day," he said. "Figure it belonged with you."
No paleji.
No explanation beyond what was necessary. The cloth hung between his fingers for a moment before he extended his hand slightly, not crossing into the circle, not breaking the line that separated him from them. Nayeli felt the weight of her own piece in her palm, the match undeniable, the memory no longer something she carried alone. Around her, the tension tightened, not in movement, but in awareness, the kind that comes when something unspoken finally takes shape in front of everyone. Takoda stepped forward then, just one step, enough to place himself between the fire and the rider, his posture straight, his presence firm but controlled. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not raise his voice. "You ride into this place alone," he said, his tone even measured, each word chosen with care. "That is either courage or ignorance." Ethan did not look away from Nayeli at first. Then, slowly, he shifted his gaze to Takoda, meeting it without challenge, without retreat. "Maybe both," he replied quietly. The wind moved through the camp again, lifting the edges of clothing, carrying the scent of dust and leather, and for a moment, everything stood suspended between what had been decided and what had not yet been spoken. Nayeli stepped forward then, just enough that the firelight caught her fully, her hand opening at last to reveal the cloth she had kept hidden, and in that small movement, the distance between past and present closed in a way no one there could ignore. The firelight stretched longer as the wind shifted, casting moving shadows that climbed across the faces in the circle, and in that shifting glow, the space between the three of them became something fragile, something that could break without a sound. Nayeli stood with both pieces of cloth now visible, one in her hand, one still extended from the rider's grasp, the match between them no longer a quiet secret, but a truth laid bare in front of everyone who had once believed they understood her path. No one spoke, not at first. The silence carried weight, thicker than before, pressing against the edges of the moment, as if waiting for someone to claim it. Takoda did not step back. He did not step forward again either. He held his ground, his presence steady, but his gaze moved between the cloth in Nayeli's hand and the man beyond the firelight, measuring something deeper than distance. "So this is the piece you would not let go," he said finally, his voice calm, but no longer untouched by what stood in front of him. Nayeli did not lower her hand. "It was never meant to be hidden," she replied, her tone quiet, but clearer now, no longer shaped by hesitation. Ethan remained where he was, his arms still extended, not forcing the gesture, not withdrawing it either, as if he understood that the choice was not his to complete. "I did not come to take anything," he said, his voice steady, each word placed with care. "Only to return what was not mine to keep." Takoda's eyes shifted to him fully now, the focus direct, unwavering. "And yet you come into a place where everything belongs to someone," he answered, not as a challenge, but as a statement that carried its own weight. Ethan nodded once, a small movement, but certain. "Then I will leave the same way I came," he said, "without taking anything that is not given." The words settled into the circle, simple, but heavier than anything that had been spoken before. Nayeli felt something tighten and then steady inside her chest, not pulled in two directions, but clarified, like a path that had been hidden beneath dust finally revealed itself when the wind passed through. She stepped forward again, one small step that brought her closer to the edge of the firelight, the heat brushing against her skin as she moved. The distance between her and Ethan shortened, not fully closed, but no longer separated by silence alone. Dakota watched her closely, and in that moment, something in his expression changed. Not anger, not defeat, but understanding, the kind that comes when a man sees a truth he cannot argue with, even if he does not accept it. "You would walk away from your people for this," he said, and though his voice remained even, there was something beneath it now, not bitterness, but a question that deserved an answer. Nayeli looked at him, truly looked, and for a moment, the weight of everything they had shared, every expectation, every silent promise, passed between them without words. "I would walk toward what is true," she said, her voice steady, not raised, not shaken, just certain in a way it had never been before. The wind moved again, lifting the edges of the cloth in her hand, and for a brief second, both pieces fluttered in the same direction, catching the same breath of air, as if they had always belonged together. No one reached for a weapon. No one raised a voice. The tension did not break into action. It settled instead, deeper, quieter, into something that demanded a choice not of strength, but of truth, and in that stillness, every person in the circle understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by force, but by the one thing no one else could claim for her. The wind settled into a low, steady breath across the camp, carrying the scent of ash and dry earth as the moment stretched beyond anything ceremony had prepared them for, and in that space, Nayeli took another step forward, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, until she stood at the very edge of the firelight where warmth met the cool of the night, and nothing remained hidden between her and the man who had come without asking for anything in return. She lifted her hand and placed her piece of cloth into Ethan's open palm, not as a surrender, not as a request, but as a completion, the two fragments meeting at last, edges aligning as if time itself had been waiting for this small, quiet act. Ethan looked down at the cloth for a brief moment, his fingers closing gently around both pieces. Then he looked back at her, and though he said nothing, something in his expression shifted, not surprise, not triumph, but understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud. Behind her, the circle remained still, every presence watching, every breath held, and Dakota did not move to stop her. He did not reach out again. He simply stood where he was, his posture unchanged, but his gaze softer now, as if the answer he had been waiting for had arrived without needing to be forced. Nayeli turned back toward him then, her eyes steady, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the silence. "I will not stand beside you tonight," she said, not with defiance, not with apology, but with a truth that belonged only to her. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the ground, into the fire, into every person who heard them. Dakota held her gaze for a long moment, the kind that measured more than time, and then he gave a small nod, not of agreement, not of defeat, but of acknowledgement, as if he understood that some paths were never meant to be shared, no matter how strong they appeared. "Then you will walk alone," he said, his voice calm, carrying neither anger nor judgment, only the weight of consequence that came with every choice made under the open sky. Nayeli did not look away. "No," she answered softly. "I will walk true." The wind rose slightly, lifting her hair, brushing against her shoulders, and for a moment, the firelight flickered low, casting the entire camp into a dimmer glow where shapes blurred and edges softened. The elder lowered his hand slowly, not in command, not in dismissal, but an acceptance of something that had already taken place beyond his control. No one stepped forward. No one spoke against her. The ceremony did not continue, but it did not break either. It simply ended, quietly, without the words that had once been prepared. Ethan shifted slightly in the saddle, his posture unchanged, his presence still respectful, still outside the line he had never crossed. He did not extend a hand to her. He did not call her name. He simply waited, the same way he had in the storm, allowing the moment to belong to her and no one else. Nayeli turned once more, her eyes moving across the faces of her people, taking in the place that had shaped her, the voices that had guided her, the ground that had always been home, and in that final look, there was no bitterness, no regret, only a quiet understanding that belonging did not always mean staying. Then she stepped past the edge of the firelight, into the open night, where the land stretched wide and unclaimed, her path no longer drawn by expectation, but by something deeper, something that did not need to be explained, only followed. The night opened wide as Nayeli stepped beyond the reach of the fire, the warmth fading from her back with each quiet step she took into the open land, and behind her the camp remained still, not broken, not whole, simply left as it was, holding the shape of something that had changed without needing to be named. The wind moved slower now, no longer sharp, just a steady breath across the desert, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and the distant promise of morning that had not yet arrived. Ethan did not move at first. He sat in the saddle, watching her cross the line no one had crossed before, his hands still resting lightly, the reins loose, as if he understood that this moment was not something to rush toward or claim. Nayeli did not look back right away. Her steps were measured, steady, each one placed with the quiet certainty of someone who had already chosen long before the moment demanded it. The ground beneath her feet felt different now, not because it had changed, but because she no longer stood where she had been told to stand. The cloth was no longer in her hand. It rested with him. The two pieces joined, no longer divided by distance or silence, and somehow that felt right, not like something lost, but something returned to where it had always belonged. When she finally stopped, it was not far from him, just beyond the edge of where the firelight could reach, where the shadows softened and the sky stretched open above them, wide and unclaimed. She lifted her eyes then, not to the camp behind her, but to him, and in that look there was no question left, no hesitation, only a quiet understanding that needed no words. Ethan shifted then, just slightly, and for the first time since he had arrived, he stepped down from the saddle, his boots touching the earth with a sound that felt heavier than it should have, not because of the weight, but because of what it meant. He did not step closer to her immediately. He did not reach out. He simply stood there, a few feet away, the joined cloth held loosely in his hand, the wind catching its edges and letting it move between them like something alive. "You walked away from everything," he said, his voice low, not accusing, not surprised, just acknowledging what he had seen. Nayeli shook her head once, a small movement, but certain. "I walked toward something," she answered, her tone calm, steady, as if the difference mattered more than anything else. Behind them, the fire dimmed further, the voices of the camp quiet, not calling her back, not pushing her forward, just allowing the distance to become what it was meant to be. Dakota remained where he had stood, his figure still within the circle of light, watching without stepping forward, his presence unchanged, but no longer reaching. The elder sat near the fire, his gaze lowered, as if he understood that some endings did not require words to be complete. The night held them all in the same silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was softer now, less heavy, like something that had been waiting to be released had finally found its way free. Ethan looked at the cloth in his hand once more, then folded it carefully, not hiding it, not keeping it, just holding it with the kind of respect one gives to something that carries more than it appears. He met her eyes again, and this time, there was no distance left between what had been and what was. He did not ask her to follow. He did not offer a path. He simply turned slightly, his body aligning with the open land ahead, as if leaving space beside him without claiming it. Nayeli stepped forward then, closing that final distance not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through the storm, through the fire, through the weight of every expectation she had left behind. And as they stood side by side, not bound, not promised, just present in the same direction, the first faint line of dawn began to rise along the horizon, soft and steady, touching the edge of the world with light that did not ask who they had been, only where they were going. Out here, nothing needed to be said. The land did not judge. The wind did not question. And the path ahead did not belong to one world or the other. It belonged to whoever had the courage to walk it without asking for permission.